my cameraman to say we're actually on. We good? Okay. We are continuing on in the book of Job with science. And this is evidence of the Ice Age. Science in the book of Job, asking the right questions. This week we're going to plunge into the first science questions I wondered about reading the book of Job. Is what I'm reading connected to the Ice Age? Because of the topic, I'm going to start the lesson the same way I got into this to begin with, looking at language in the book of Job. So the language of the Ice Age. The text of Job contains many hints that Job indeed lived during the Ice Age. The book of Job has more references to ice than any other book of the Bible. The book of Job also has 5 references to snow, which is as many as any other book. Psalms is the only other book that mentions it 5 times. This suggests Job was very familiar with ice and snow. Job lived in the land of Uz, which was to the east. This area is quite warm today, and snow is uncommon, but during the Ice Age, things would have been very different. Now, I did a lot of research and pulled a lot of articles, so I'm going to quote a lot more articles this week than previously. James Johnson published in the Institute for Creation Research in 2014. The Institute for Creation Research scientists have repeatedly analyzed the Ice Age, showing how a solitary post-flood Ice Age was both relatively brief and recent. A scientific model based on the biblical account fits the geological facts much better than explanations offered by old Earth evolutionists. However, beyond the chronological data for a young Earth, does the Bible provide evidence that corroborates the idea of a recent Ice Age? Yes. Although ignored by most readers, the vocabulary of the book of Job actually corroborates the scenario of a recent Ice Age caused by the global climate conditions that likely followed the worldwide flood. ICR's founder, Dr. Henry Morris, wrote, "There are more references to cold, snow, ice, and frost in Job than in any other book of the Bible." How can a book's vocabulary be forensic evidence of global climate conditions? Let's consider what's in the book of Job. Snow is in the book of Job 5 times. The word is sheleg. It's snow, but it's describing the whiteness of it. This is found in Job 6:16, which are dark because of the ice, and into the snow which vanishes. Job 9:30, if I wash myself with snow water and cleanse my hands with soap. Job 24:19, as drought and heat consume the snow waters, so the grave consumes those who have sinned. Job 37:6, for he says to the snow, fall on the earth, likewise to the gentle rain and the heavy rain of his strength. Job 38:22, have you entered the treasury of snow, or have you seen the treasure of hail? The word ice is a word that is only used in the book of Job. There is no other book in the Bible that uses this word, karak. It's a word that means ice as if bald, smooth. Hence, hail by resemblance, rock, crystal. Job 6:16 talks about how dark the ice is. Job 37:10, by the breath of God, ice is given and the broad waters are frozen. Job 38:29, from whose womb comes the ice, and the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? And the word frost in Job 38:29 is kefor. It's a cover, it's white frost that covers the ground. Cold comes from the north. God's breath gives frost. There are treasuries of snow and hail, and ice is delivered like childbirth. Does Job's icy vocabulary sound like Jamaicans talking or Alaskans? Job's book, which records events that occurred a few generations after the global flood, uses language that fits the life experiences of people living during the post-flood Ice Age. So let's look at, next, the timing of the Ice Age. Answers in Genesis has a whole bunch of resources on this. But the one I want to talk to you or quote from is Where Does the Ice Age Fit? It was published in 2007 by Michael Ord, and it's part of the New Answers book, book 1, chapter 16. And part of his article says the total length of time for a post-flood ice age is about 700 years. It was indeed a rapid ice age. Since the flood offers a viable explanation for the ice age, one could expect that ice age would be mentioned in the Bible. Is it possible the book of Job, written about 500 years or so after the flood, may include a reference to the ice age in Job 38, 29, and 30, which says, "From whose womb comes the ice, and the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? The waters harden like a stone, and the surface of the deep is frozen." The Institute for Creation Research also mentions the Ice Age. Dr. Jason Lisle in 2018, in the book Origins on the Global Flood, talks about the conditions required for an ice age. The global flood described in Genesis 6 through 7 would naturally result in the conditions necessary to cause an ice age, as demonstrated by creation scientist Michael Ord. During the flood, the fountains of the great deep burst open. This may refer to underwater volcanoes, perhaps nearly all the volcanoes on Earth erupting simultaneously. In any case, the flood was associated with violent tectonic activity. Most creation scientists believe the continents were connected before the flood in a single landmass, which split apart during the Genesis flood. The enormous energy from this geological activity would warm the ocean waters substantially. Secondly, the volcanic activity would eject aerosols into the Earth's atmosphere. This would continue to some extent even after the waters from the flood retreated and the land appeared. These aerosols reflect some sunlight back into space. Since less sunlight reaches the continents, they would be cooler than normal. Even today, when a major volcano erupts, it results in a temporary reduction in Earth's atmosphere. Warm oceans and cool continents are the ideal conditions for the formation of glaciers. The warm ocean water would evaporate, the moist air would move over the cool land masses. As the air cools, it cannot maintain its moisture and snow would fall onto the land. In the centuries that followed the global flood, the ice sheets built up over time. The warm oceans, along with the aerosols in the atmosphere, would have it resulted in mild seasons, relatively cool summers, and warm winters. Since much of the Earth's water would be locked up in glaciers, the oceans would have been over 300 feet lower than they are today. This would result in natural land bridges and ice bridges between land masses that today are separated by water. This is an important consideration because the descendants of the animals aboard Noah's Ark were dispersing to various parts of the world. People sometimes ask how the animals got from one continent to another without realizing the lower ocean levels would result in natural land and ice bridges. Although the exact timescale is difficult to estimate, most creation scientists believe that the Ice Age built up for a few centuries after the global flood and then receded over the next few centuries as geological activity waned. This is significant because it means that certain biblical persons would have lived during the Ice Age. These include Abraham and Job. We have good evidence from science and from the text of Scripture that an ice age occurred shortly after the global flood and as a direct consequence of it. With so much of Earth's water trapped in glaciers, ocean levels would have been at least 300 feet lower than today, resulting in land bridges and ice bridges between the continents. This was no accident. It was by the providence of God and helped the animals migrate to the various continents. Now, those are just the articles. Let's look at some of the clues in Job about the Ice Age. Talking about recent ice, and this verse is going to keep coming up. Job 38, 29 through 30. From whose womb comes the ice, and the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? The waters harden like stone, and the surface of the deep is frozen. This is talking about new ice forming, which isn't that unusual in most places on our planet. But this is highly unusual for the Mediterranean climate and in the Middle East. This is not a casual ice. The surface of the deep is frozen. How long does it need to be cold? And how cold does it need to be for a deep body of water to develop a solid sheet of ice? It takes a long time. It takes serious cold. This is not just a winter storm that froze some pond. This is deep water that is freezing hard. Okay, so recent ice is apparently in the book of Job. Let's look at glacier melts. Job 6:16 says, which are dark because of the ice and into which the snow vanishes. I mentioned that already. And when we drive in snowy conditions, if you've ever done that, you know the scariest thing is black ice on the road. But this isn't just talking about snow going away. Let's look at a little bit broader context. Job 6:15 through 17. My brothers have dealt deceitfully like a brook, like the streams of the brooks that pass away, which are dark because of the ice, and into which the snow vanishes. When it is warm, they cease to flow. When it is hot, they vanish from their place. This is not just talking about a little bit of ice melting or snow melting. This is talking about these waters that were streams of fresh water that existed and then ceased to exist. Well, why would they completely cease? These are frozen streams that melt, evaporate, and don't come back. As global temperatures shifted to warmer, many streams that were the result of glacial melt just vanished. Archaeology has discovered many former water sources in places that are now complete deserts. In fact, when we talk about the Fertile Crescent, one of the things that I first thought as a kid was, how is that the Fertile Crescent? That's the middle of the desert. They have done lots of surface studies, and using LIDAR, they've discovered several major rivers used to run through the Arabian Desert. The peninsula of Sinai is bleak now, but they can see where rivers ran, where they pushed stones through a riverbed, and where everything dried up. This makes sense if at the end of the flood there were glaciers that were melting over time, and for a long time they provided water sources, and then around the time Job was alive, they were melting away, never to come back. Let's look at tidal floods and overflows. Now, I found an article online called On Finding an Ice Age Book by Dr. Bernard E. Northrup. And if you're really interested in all the science in the book of Job and conclusions that can be drawn from it, his article is really long, but I would recommend reading the whole thing because he talks about a lot of things that I didn't even consider when I'm looking at the book of Job, and he ties a lot of things together. Oh, but I'm just going to read the part about the Ice Age. He describes in this his abrupt awakening to the requirement by the catastrophic contents of the book of Job that brought him to recognize a post-Noahic flood, thoroughly biblical Ice Age catastrophe. In the book of Job, there is also literary evidence which indicates the sea near the scene of the book was greatly disturbed. What sea? We don't know. Where was the book Land of Uz? In the east. That's about all we know. So what sea is it? We don't know. When the reader of the book becomes aware of its remarkable statements about the sea, it opens the door of his understanding concerning life in the land, which became Israel during the centuries when the continents were dividing. Job was a desert dweller, judging from the pastoral scenes which are clearly described in the book. In spite of this fact, the book repeatedly mentions the sea. Now, it is open to question whether the book is referring to the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, or to a body of water which lay much closer to southern Transjordanian territories where Job appears to have lived. There was such a body of water in Israel where only the remnants of that body can be found today. I've examined the Jordan Rift several times in visits to that area. I've been forced by the evidence there to recognize that the scientists are correct when they say that a giant lake filled all of the Jordan Valley. This was not merely an enlarged Dead Sea, which is easily recognized by the many fossil beaches that lie above the present lake level. It was a sea that filled both the Sea of Galilee to the north and the Dead Sea joining them in a great lake that left beaches hundreds of feet above the present level of the Jordan River, which joins them. Evidently, Job lived along the shoreline of his day. He described what it was like to live in the eastern Mediterranean coastline lands when tidal waves were roaring ashore, generated by great crustal movement. Speaking of God, he breaks down, and it cannot be built up again. He shuts up a man, and there can be no opening. He withholds the water, and they dry up. Also, he sends them out, and they overturn the earth. This describes exactly what happens when a tidal wave approaches the coast. First of all, the waters along the coast begin to retreat. I have no doubt that Job is likening the way that his three counselors have pummeled him with their fiercely accusing words to the tsunami, that his earth movement generated tidal waves, which are found elsewhere in the book. He says of them, they break up my path, they further my calamity, they have no helper. They come as broad breakers. Under the ruinous storm they roll along. Terrors are turned upon me. That's Job 30, 13 through 15. In Job 26, 10 through 12, Job uses language which strongly suggests God's mighty power over the sea, even to the agitation of the ocean. What Dr. Northrup describes in his article is the continents still settling after the flood. As the glaciers are melting, pressures are changing on the earth, and waters are receding still. After the flood, how long did it take for the waters to come all the way off the earth? That's a question I don't have an answer for, I'm sorry. But there was frozen water, there were great lakes, there were waters that were dammed up by ice. The Grand Canyon is actually one of the best examples of a post-flood cataclysm caused by ice melting and a great lake that existed above it, rapidly eroding all the sediment there. Dr. Northrup believes that the same thing was happening in Israel today. What is Israel today? The Jordanian Valley was full of water, all glacial melt. And at some point, the crust was still cracking. And the Jordanian Valley is part of the Great Rift that goes all the way down into Africa. It's this giant split in their crust. And he believes that Job was alive when it further split and all that great sea roared out of what used to be a sea. He would have been familiar with glacial calving. As icebergs broke off of the glaciers that were around him and fell into the bodies of water, they would have cast large waves onto the shorelines. There's one more thing that I noted, which is clearing skies. Job 37:21 says, even now men cannot look at the light when it is bright in the skies, when the wind has passed and cleared them. And I thought to myself, why is this unusual? Like every time I go outside and the sun is out, I don't look at the sun. I know it's too bright to look at. But why would he say this? Why would this come up? Is this just clouds clearing after a brief storm and people are like, oh, it's so bright outside? Or is this talking about something bigger? After the flood, the cloud canopy would have been pretty continuous. It would have been very difficult to see the sun for many years with all the volcanic activity, all the aerosols in the air, all the evaporated seawater forming this giant cloud canopy. It may have been that there was not much sun to be seen. The sun sure would have been shining through the clouds. But as these clouds continued to condense and create the glaciers, the clouds was slowly cleared. And then as the winds blew, there would be gaps in the clouds, which men hadn't seen for possibly 100 years. And suddenly, they're looking at the sun directly again. Whoa, no filter. They couldn't see it directly. It was unusual for them. This seems to be a part of the book of Job that's describing the end of the Ice Age. And when you look at what climate shifts had to occur for there to be an ice age and a post-ice age, this makes sense given Job's timing. So I tend to go with that. All right. Next. Oh, my box didn't translate through. That says Ark Encounter question. So this is in the Ark Encounter, which I'm hoping to see soon. But the question is, one ice age or many? There are different worldviews that lead to different conclusions. Our worldview shapes what we see, and though this diagram shows 4 on the right for the secular view, there are scientists that claim up to 20 major and minor ice events, but currently seems to be a majority agree on 5 major ice ages. But this requires what is known as deep time, lasting millions of years. For those that believe in the truth of the Bible, there isn't enough time. Hence, we believe in just one ice age starting after the flood, as viewed on the right or on the left. The question is important, though. Just like secular scientists think that over millions of years, there are lots and lots of floods, and throughout this deep time, the Central Valley of California was an ocean for a while, and then it wasn't. And over here, this was ocean, and then it wasn't. And they have to have all these mini flood events so that all the flood legends can be accounted for with local floods instead of just doing once and done. The whole earth was covered with water. The marine animals thrived in a warm, freshwater ocean, and then the waters retreated, leaving evidence of all those animals all over the continents. I think we actually have it easier explaining it with what's in the Bible one time. Secular scientists believe that there's too many ice events to be described as one thing, just once. And I have no problem with that. We should not have a problem with that. All right, the next question is, what did humans look like in the Ice Age? Oh, blurry picture. And that's fine. We don't actually have a lot of records of, okay, what were humans like in the Ice Age? If you look through the book of Genesis, after the flood, there's a genealogy. There's not a lot of information in that genealogy. This person lived for 600 years. This person lived for 450 years. This person lived for 430 years. This person lived for 420 years. But it doesn't say what they were doing at the time. It was after the flood. They were rebuilding civilization. They were cultivating plants. They were raising cattle. We get to the book of Job and we see that there's still people raising cattle and doing harvests and all these things. But science says there were people that weren't quite people during the Ice Age. They like to think of these as cavemen or Neanderthals. But I want to address this issue that's presented by secular science. They suggest humanity was just developing during the last Ice Age, and only as the earth warmed did civilization start to bloom. Yet from biblical history, we see there were great civilizations before the flood. And from Genesis and Job, we know these were wiped off the planet by the flood because of their sin. Only a few generations after the flood, humanity built the great tower at Babel, only to be dispersed across the planet by God himself. Was the Ice Age already happening at that point? The answer is yes. Think of all the land bridges that were only open because the seawaters were locked in ice. It almost needed to be an Ice Age for the great diaspora to occur at this point. Not everything was frozen, and land bridges would have allowed Noah's descendants to truly fill the earth as God commanded. So yes, humanity lived through the whole Ice Age. But who were they? Let's look at the book of Job. Job 31 through 15 says, "But now they mock at me, men younger than I, whose fathers I disdain to put with the dogs of my flock. Indeed, what profit is the strength of their hands to me? Their vigor has perished. They are gaunt from want and famine, fleeing late into the wilderness, desolate and waste, who pluck mallow by the bushes and broom tree roots for their food. They were driven out from among men. They shouted at them as a thief. They had to live in the clefts of the valleys, in caves of the earth and the rocks. Among the bushes they brayed, under the nettles they nested. They were the sons of fools, yes, sons of vile men. They were scourged from the land. And now I am their byword. They abhor me. They keep far from me. They do not hesitate to spit in my face. Because God has loosed my bowstring and afflicted me. They have cast off restraint before me. At my right hand, the rabble rises. They push away my feet, and they raise against me their ways of destruction. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. They have no helper. They come as broad breakers. Under the ruinous storm, they roll along. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my honor as the wind, and my prosperity has passed like a cloud. Who were these men living in caves? They were men, but their living situation is desperate. Unlike Job, formerly and again in the future, these men were living off the land, had no permanent housing, and were described as brutish fools. There is evidence that human societies lived near the edge of the ice sheet in Western Europe throughout the Ice Age. The Neanderthal peoples, for instance. Many anthropologists now recognize their somewhat brutish appearance was at least partly due to disease, rickets, arthritis, caused by the dark, cold, and damp climate of the region at the time. Their resulting lack of exposure to sunlight, which stimulates vitamin D synthesis, necessary for normal bone development, and poor diet would have caused rickets. That's according to Creation Answers book, chapter 16. Now, earlier in this series, we talked about the extreme old age that's mentioned in the book of Job. Words that are only used in the book of Job to describe the very old. Let's remember, Shem was still alive. Shem's children were still alive. Eber was still alive, who we get the term Hebrew from. These were very old men. In fact, Shem would have been about 700 years old at the time that Job was alive. And Shem outlived Job, outlived Abraham, outlived Isaac, outlived Jacob, and only Joseph outlived Shem. How does extreme old age affect bone development? Osteoporosis is one side of things. What's the other side? Did you know you have two sets of bones in your body that continue to get denser as you get older? One is your pelvis, which doesn't affect a whole lot, structurally speaking. But the part that gets denser as you get older is your eyebrow ridge. This is known as the occipital ridge. And if you trace your finger across your eyebrow, you'll notice that you've got two arches. Those arches are very important for your skull because when you bite, you have muscles compressing your jaw so that you can break things in your mouth. Mechanical digestion occurs in your mouth. But if you didn't have these ridges, you would actually crush your skull if you bit into something a little too hard. As you continue chewing throughout your life, the bone density in your occipital ridges gets denser. It gets thicker. And it depends on your diet. If you're eating mostly soft foods and you don't have to chew very hard, then your brow ridge will develop less quickly. But let's suggest that you're plucking mallow at the bushes and eating broom tree roots. Those are hard to chew. They're very fibrous. And let's say you live 400 to 600 years. Chewing. You will develop a very thick cranial ridge. Let's look at this image, which is actually from Answers in Genesis, of a caveman or Neanderthal. Most modern scientists who are honest with themselves will admit that the Neanderthals are actually humans. They're not pre-humans. They're not proto-humans. They're humans. And they display signs of extreme old age. Who were cavemen? Cavemen is a phrase that has been phased out in science because guess what? People still live in caves. They're really nice caves. Some people live in very bad caves, but people live in caves. People have always lived in caves. Why? It's a convenient shelter. During the Ice Age, as the Earth was still in limbo, breaking up, as continents are shaking, it would have been very difficult to build permanent housing. Wherever there's an earthquake, you find people who live in flexible housing. Tents are more popular. Something that can be quickly torn down, put back up, or just fall over and you're not going to worry about it because it's not going to kill the occupants of the house. But as the Earth's crust is breaking and cracking, all these holes in the ground would have appeared. And they're made out of rock. In a very shaky time, humanity would have sought the shelter of rock caves to protect them from the elements, not just the cold and the storms, but also the earthquakes. If people have lived in caves from the beginning of time and still live in caves today, there's no question there were cavemen during the Ice Age. But they were just people who lived in caves. One of the weird arguments I ran across several times in doing this research is secular scientists keep questioning whether anybody could have been literate at this point. Like, who would have been writing? Like, did people really write back in the day? Like, how old is the book of Job? I believe Job is one of the oldest books of the Bible. I believe it is the first book that was written in the Bible. It was written before Genesis because Moses lived 400 years after Joseph died, and Job lived before Joseph's ancestors. So Job was alive well before. But in the book of Job, Job constantly talks about writing, sometimes with a steel pen on rock, but he talks about writing, inscribing, write it down. I wish my words were in a book. These are the words of a literate person. How come we don't find writings in caves? Well, I'm sure the people who lived in the caves didn't think, this is going to be very important someday, so I'm going to write it on the wall. They painted in caves. We've got lots of cave paintings. They're not the works of unskilled men. They're not the works of people who were completely ignorant about the world. They're very detailed drawings. And one of my rabbit trails, one of the scientists who studies cave drawings noticed that a lot of cave drawings seem to be really rudimentary and looks like the painters were doing like two perspectives and they couldn't figure out which one to do. But then he thought, these men were not painting with a stable halogen light or LED panels. They're writing and drawing with fire as their light. And fire has this interesting flickering effect. So he went into one of these caves with all the permissions properly written out and brought a torch, an actual fire torch. And he said in the torchlight, the cave paintings move because it changes the angle of what you see. And these ancient painters who were not brutes painted scenes that seemed to move in the firelight because they were gifted by God in that way. Anyway, that was a whole rabbit trail I went into looking at cave people. Okay, brow ridges. That's where I got sidetracked. The brow ridge indicates these men were old. that they had chewed for their whole life, and they continued to develop the brow ridge. A lot of the other bone structures, from what we know in archaeology, are explained by lack of nutrition. These men were eating whatever came to hand. They ate a lot of meat, they ate a lot of raw roots. They weren't doing great. And Job mentions that. These are men I wouldn't even put with my dogs that guard the sheep, much less the sheep. I wouldn't trust them with my sheep. They'd eat my sheep. These men have been driven out, and they're hiding in places where they can hide, where they don't have to do a lot of work. They're not cultivating anything. They're not raising anything. They're living off the land and not in a good way. So, what's the conclusion? As we study scriptures, we see plenty of evidence for the Ice Age in just this one book. The more we dive in, the more we uncover the science behind the belief, the worldviews of both creationists and secular scientists. Everybody has bias in what they understand because of what they believe. If you truly believe the Word of God is perfect, accurate, and inspired, there's no reason to think the Bible wouldn't have evidence of such a major event in Earth's history. The reason it isn't highlighted is that unlike the flood, the Ice Age was endurable by hardy humans who knew how to adapt, and it had no bearing on the promise of the Messiah. There's no conflict with the facts uncovered by science, only with the conclusions drawn by secular evolutionary theories. The Bible does not contradict the facts. It does support what we know and confirm the truth. There was a recent flood, followed by an ice age. Shem lived through both events and outlived Abraham and Job, who he may have spoken to about his experiences. The Ice Age was real and witnessed by men who were literate enough to describe what they saw and incorporated words and metaphors based on the catastrophic events into their everyday language. The Ice Age highlights God's power and mercy on a recently broken world. God allowed humanity to multiply and to spread through the whole world and divided us up with the changing climate. We're blessed enough to not have to live through anything like it. I believe that Job has concrete evidence that men lived through the Ice Age. And God reveals his power and his mercy through the science. All right. Any questions or comments?
I can't help it just because something kind of cool. Thank you, first of all, for doing this. It's awesome, and we're definitely learning a lot with it. Where this picture was taken behind you is the Moreno Glacier, about an hour west of El Calafate in Argentina, in Patagonia. And 6 weeks from today, Lord willing, Marjorie and I will actually be standing in this very spot.
That's awesome.
So for our 25th anniversary. So it just, yeah. I'm sorry that she's not feeling well today, but I actually sent a picture to her.
So I picked the right one up. That's awesome.
And believe it or not, that's what you're looking at is actually about 300 feet from bottom to top right there. And then it keeps going down quite a bit. And it just goes for miles and miles, but awesome. So.
And I will say one more thing. A really great evidence for a recent ice age. We are watching glaciers melt. One of the glaciers, I forget whether, I've been looking at too many glaciers this last week, either in the Alps or in the Andes, is gone. And we've been recording pictures of the glaciers for 120 years now, and we can watch the glacier disappear. If the last ice age was 10,000 years ago, and we've had warm and cold seasons, there would be no glaciers left. This glacier is still huge, and yet it is shrinking at a rate that's measurable. And we can clock that backwards. And guess what? about 4,500 years ago is about the maximum that glacier could have reached. So it's a really cool thing. All right, any other questions, comments? All right, thank you.